Hello everyone. Today we will discuss one of the influential texts produced by the Western neo-Marxist tradition, Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, subtitled Philosophical Fragments. Written between 1939 and 1944 during their exile in the United States and published in 1947, this book represents the theoretical core of the first generation Frankfurt School's critical theory. To understand the stakes of this book, we must listen closely to the question the authors ask in their initial 1944 preface. They write, "What we had set out to do was nothing less than to explain why humanity, instead of entering a truly human state, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism." Notice how deeply radical this framing is. Horkheimer and Adorno were not simply trying to analyze the political mechanics of Nazi Germany, nor were they merely critiquing the economic dislocations of monopoly capitalism. They were diagnosing a profound civilizational failure. Writing under the shadow of the Holocaust, fascism, and the rise of the total corporate administered state in the West, they argued that the horrors of the 20th century were not accidental detours or temporary aberrations. They were not caused by a few evil individuals or a simple lapse into irrationality. Rather, the authors asserted that barbarism is rooted deeply in the fundamental nature of Western civilization and rationality itself. Our task today is to trace this argument across the entire text. We will unpack its foundational conceptual claims, analyze its historical and literary examples, investigate its famous critique of mass culture, decode its socio-psychological anatomy of anti-Semitism, and finally synthesize its philosophical notes on human nature and the administered world. The intellectual architecture of the entire book rests upon a twin paradox. Horkheimer and Adorno summarize their framework in two symmetrical dialectical theses. First, myth is already enlightenment. Second, enlightenment reverts to mythology. To understand the first thesis, we must redefine what enlightenment actually means. In the history of philosophy, we usually associate enlightenment with the 18th century project of Voltaire and Kant. This was an intellectual movement designed to banish superstition, promote scientific reasoning, and establish human liberty. But Horkheimer and Adorno define enlightenment in its widest historical and anthropological sense. The advance of human thought aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters over nature. When human beings in antiquity created myths, they were already attempting to do precisely this. Myth was not just arbitrary fantasy, it was an early form of ordering, naming, and classifying the terrifying chaos of the natural world. By attributing specific realms to specific gods, such as Poseidon over the sea, Zeus over the sky, mythical consciousness tried to map, predict, and make nature familiar. Myth sought to control nature through ritual, sacrifice, and imitation. Thus, the core impulse of enlightenment, the desire to escape from nature's blind power by understanding and mastering it, was already driving the creation myth. But how does the second thesis work? How does enlightenment revert to mythology? The authors point to Francis Bacon, whom they label the father of experimental philosophy. Bacon declared that knowledge is power. In the Baconian model, the mind does not seek to understand meaning, essence, or the inner truth of a thing for the sake of contemplation. It seeks operation, method, and the calculation of effects. To become fully mastered, nature must be completely stripped of its internal animism, its qualitative differences, and its subjective meanings. Under modern mathematical science, everything is flattened. The complex qualitative textures of life are converted into abstract formulas, neutral numbers, and statistical probabilities. The rich concept is replaced by the mathematical formula. This is what Horkheimer and Adorno call instrumental reason. Reason is no longer an ethical or philosophical tool used to judge whether an action is inherently good, just, or true. Instead, reason becomes a purely bureaucratic, mechanical tool used to calculate the most efficient means to achieve an unexamined end. Here is the trap. When reason becomes entirely instrumental, it can no longer generate values or defend human freedom. It behaves like a blind machine. It demands absolute obedience to facts and reality as it currently exists. It treats human beings as mere numbers, variables, and units of labor to be manipulated. Therefore, by ruthlessly eliminating all qualitative values and meaning, Enlightenment creates a new form of absolute unyielding fate. The modern citizen is just as paralyzed, helpless, and terrified before the cold, blind laws of the global economic market and state bureaucracy as early humans were before the arbitrary whims of the storm gods. The fully enlightenment earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. Rationality has turned into a brutal new mythology. To ground this highly abstract philosophical claim in historical reality, the authors include two major historical excursions. The first focuses on Homer's Odyssey, which they view as one of the earliest representative documents of Western bourgeois civilization and subjectivity. Odysseus is analyzed as the prototype of the modern bourgeois individual. His 10-year voyage back to Ithaca is not just an adventure. It is a symbolic allegory of the human mind struggling to separate itself from and survive against the overwhelming power of mythical nature. To overcome the monsters, sirens, and gods he encounters, Odysseus must employ a tool that prefigures modern rationality, instrumental cunning, and sacrifice. The most famous example analyzed in the book is Odysseus' encounter with the sirens. The sirens sing a song of absolute beauty, memory, and reconciliation with nature. Their song is an invitation to yield, to let go of the painful struggle of survival, and to sink back into a peaceful pre rational state. But Odysseus knows that if he yields, his ship will crash against the rocks and his project of self preservation will fail. To survive this temptation while continuing his journey, Odysseus devises a cold, rational division of labor that mirrors the modern class structure of capitalist society. First, the workers, the rowers. Odysseus commands his oarsmen to plug their ears with wax. They are forced to look straight ahead and exert purely physical labor to propel the ship forward. They are kept entirely blind and deaf to the song of beauty, art, and happiness. This is the fate of the modern working class. Their labor is purely instrumental and they are systematically cut off from the cultural fruits of their work to keep production running smoothly. Second, the master, Odysseus. Odysseus wants to hear the beautiful song, but he cannot allow himself to act on it. So he commands his men to bind him tightly to the ship's mast, instructing them that no matter how much he begs or screams to be released, they must bind him even tighter. The image of Odysseus bound to the mast is a haunting critique of modern elite subjectivity. The bourgeois master can enjoy culture, art, and beauty, but only as a passive consumer. He is physically paralyzed by his own social role, bound to the mast of his economic enterprise and self preservation. He cannot live out the truth of the art he hears. He hears the song of happiness but cannot reach it. Horkheimer and Adorno demonstrate through this allegory that the formation of the rational human ego requires a brutal history of renunciation and self repression. To dominate external nature, human being must first completely crush, manipulate, and sacrifice the internal nature within themselves. The self is born through violence against the self. The second excursion leaps from ancient Greece to Central Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, focusing on the dark, radical underside of the High Enlightenment project. Here, the authors stage an unexpected confrontation between Kant, Marquis de Sade, and Nietzsche. For Kant, enlightenment is the human being's emergence from self incurred immaturity, guided by a reason that seeks to organize all thought into a unified, consistent logical system. Reason, in this high bourgeois view, is scientific, objective, and neutral. It is a cognitive apparatus that categorizes, calculates, and classifies things without injecting personal feelings. Horkheimer and Adorno point out a critical flaw. If reason is truly reduced to a neutral scientific tool for systematic calculation, it becomes completely blind to values. It cannot provide any logical or empirical reason why compassion is superior to cruelty or why freedom is better than tyranny. If a system is internally consistent and functions efficiently, instrumental reason must validate it. There is no logical argument against evil. To prove this, they examine Marquis de Sade's scandalous 18th century novel Juliette. Sade did not write mere pornography, he wrote an execution of Enlightenment logic. Juliette is a cold, hyper rational woman who treats vice, torture, exploitation, and murder as a highly organized scientific experiment. She rejects all traditional religious morals and sentimentality because they cannot be proven by cold, hard scientific observation. She treats human bodies as raw material to be measured, calculated, and discarded. Sade's writings prefigure the modern factory production line, the assembly line, applying it directly to human flesh and power dynamics. By tracing this line through Nietzsche's naked celebration of the will to power, Horkheimer and Adorno show how Enlightenment's demand to subjugate all natural impulses to the sovereign mind culminates in the rise of absolute amoral totalitarianism. When reason is stripped of its critical ethical spirit and becomes a mere calculation machine, it effortlessly serves the needs of the fascist bureaucrat, the concentration camp administrator, or the ruthless corporate executive. The moral rigor of the Enlightenment collapses into the absolute systematic amorality of the modern world. Kant's good citizen and Sade's cruel criminal are secret twins, both children of instrumental reason. We now turn to what is undoubtedly the most widely read and debated section of the book, their critique of mass culture under advanced capitalism, a system they explicitly label the culture industry. Horkheimer and Adorno deliberately rejected terms like popular culture or mass culture. They argued that these terms are deeply ideological because they suggest that mass culture is something that bubbles up spontaneously from ordinary people. It does not. The culture industry is a highly centralized, top down commercial apparatus controlled by corporate monopolies and state power. It treats films, radio broadcasts, magazines, and music not as art but as commodities produced on an industrial assembly line. The culture industry marks the absolute triumph of instrumental reason over the human imagination. Its core characteristics are as follows. First, total standardization and formulaic production. In the culture industry, everything is standardized. Every Hollywood movie, pop song, or radio show follows the exact same predictable formulas, rhythmic beats, and structural arcs. The culture industry calculates its products down to the second to trigger specific consumer reactions. Real art is supposed to challenge us, disturb us, and force us to reflect critically on our lives and society. The culture industry, by contrast, eliminates all genuine novelty. It merely repackages the exact same product over and over again under the illusion of variety. Second, the collapse of art into a work and passive consumption. The culture industry turns leisure time into an extension of industrial labor. After a long, exhausting day of mechanized, repetitive work in a factory or office, the worker is too exhausted of critical dialectical thought. They demand amusement and distraction. The culture industry provides entertainment that requires zero intellectual effort, zero attention, and zero imagination. It does your thinking for you before you even buy the ticket. Amusements become a psychological drug designed to soothe anxiety and make you accept your lack of freedom. Third, pseudo individuality and false freedom. The culture industry pretends to celebrate the unique individual. Consumers are given a massive menu of choices, different brands of cars, different film genres, different musical subcultures. But Horkheimer and Adorno argue that this is a deeper form of control which they call pseudo individuality. The choices are completely superficial. Whether you choose brand A or brand B, you remain locked within the exact same consumer system. Your tastes, desires, and identities have been manufactured for you by corporate planners. Freedom is reduced to the freedom to choose which identical product you want to buy. The tragic final consequence of the culture industry is the liquidation of the individual self. By filling every spare minute of human consciousness with prefabricated images, catchy pop hooks, and synchronized spectacles, the system destroys the psychological space required for quiet reflection, negative thinking, and resistance. Mass culture acts as an ideological curtain, a soft totalitarianism that keeps the population passive, compliant, and under a spell of mass deception. If the chapter on culture industry shows how enlightenment turns progress into soft psychological compliance, the chapter titled Elements of Anti-Semitism deals with the terrifying return of raw, naked barbarism in reality. Here, the authors sketch a profound philosophical prehistory of anti Semitism to understand the Nazi Holocaust. They argue that fascist anti Semitism is not a random explosion of primitive pre modern hatred. Instead, it is an organic product of the psychological pathology of modern, advanced, rationalized society. They explain this through three intellectual distinct concepts. First, false projection and mimesis. Human beings have a primal, deep seated urge for mimesis, the desire to mimic nature, express immediate emotions, and seek physical pleasure. But as we saw with Odysseus, to survive in modern industrial capitalism, the individual must completely repress this mimetic urge. They must become cold, rigid, and completely obedient to the clock and the machine. This creates an intense unconscious store of resentment. The modern subject secretly hates the heavy sacrifices demanded of them by the civilized state. Fascist manipulation weaponizes this resentment through false projection. The dominant culture projects all its forbidden, repressed desires onto a scapegoat group, historically the Jews. The anti-Semite projects onto the Jewish community an imaginary image of unchecked pleasure, international freedom, happiness without hard manual work, and deep intellectual meaning. Second, the rage of self-denial. The anti-Semite is deeply triggered by this projection because they have brutally forced themselves to deny their own natural impulses. They cannot tolerate seeing anyone else allegedly enjoying them. The urge to destroy the scapegoat is actually a desperate, twisted attempt to murder their own repressed inner nature. They prosecute the minority group because they see in them the ghost of their own lost happiness and freedom. Third, authoritarian ticket thinking. Modern bureaucratic society flattens language and thought into pre-packaged slogans, checkboxes, and ideologies, a phenomenon the authors call ticket thinking. People no longer think through complex socio-economic problems on their own. Instead, they buy into a political ticket, a pre-packaged set of dogmas provided by powerful elites, demagogues, and media networks. Anti Semitism functions as a total political ticket. It provides a single, simple, paranoid explanation for all the anxieties, economic panics, and psychological miseries produced by advanced capitalism. The Jews are behind it. Once an individual swallows this ticket, their critical faculties are completely turned off. They become part of a blind, automated collective capable of administering industrial mass death with the cold, detached efficiency of a factory line. To close our lecture, we must bring all these fragments together into a single cohesive diagnosis of the modern condition, the transition to what the authors call the administered world. When Horkheimer and Adorno looked across the post World War II global landscape, they did not see a simple victory of freedom over totalitarianism. Instead, they saw an objective historical trend toward total social integration, whether under the state directed monopoly capitalism of the West, the bureaucratic state socialism of the Eastern Bloc, or the brutal experiments of European fascism, the structural result was terrifyingly similar. First, the annihilation of the genuine individual. The independent thinker, the eccentric outsider, and the autonomous critical subject are completely nullified by immense corporate and state bureaucracies. Second, the rise of comfortable unfreedom. Individuals are provided for by the social apparatus better than ever before. Their material standard of living rises. They have access to hygienic factories, consumer goods, and endless amusements. But their powerlessness and psychological complaints increase along with the number of goods allocated to them. They become passive cogs in a machine they cannot control. Third, the death of critical philosophy. Genuine thinking is liquidated and replaced by positivism, a philosophical attitude that limits the mind to merely observing facts and calculating probabilities, while completely tabooing any negative thought that seeks to transcend the existing order. Intelligence becomes synonymous with hostility to the mind. Is there any hope left in this dark diagnosis? Horkheimer and Adorno reject easy utopian formulas or revolutionary optimism. They recognize that under total integration, even the traditional language of political opposition is immediately captured, commodified, and neutralized by the culture industry. Instead, they argue that the true office of critical theory is to act as an imaginary witness. Philosophy must refuse to obey the prevailing intellectual demands of the status quo. It must use the power of negative thinking to look directly into the hell of the present, reflecting on the deconstructive side of progress to keep the memory of past hopes alive. It must remember that things could be otherwise even when all evidence says they cannot. The dialectic enlightenment remains a vital warning for our 21st century world of global digital algorithms, corporate surveillance capitalism, mass media spectacles, and the resurgence of populist paranoia. It challenges us to realize that our technological advances are not a guarantee of human progress. If we do not cultivate the capacity for self reflection and critical reason, our tools will continue to dominate us, and our highly enlightened earth will remain radiant with triumphant calamity.